"That old man can't even see the target," Colton Radcliffe said, loud enough for the whole firing line to hear, and the crowd around him laughed the easy laugh of people who trust the man holding the microphone. Every Sunday for 4 years, a farmer nobody at the range has ever spoken to parks at the far end of the lot, watches through the fence for exactly 1 hour, and drives home without ever paying for a lane. Nobody at Millwood Long Range Facility could tell you his name. Nobody had asked. Here is what would happen 40 minutes after Colton's joke landed. A steel plate standing 2,400 meters downrange. A plate 31 paying students had failed to touch all season. A plate mounted so far out that spotters needed a 15-power scope just to confirm a hit. That plate would ring like a church bell. On the first shot, fired by a rifle the shooter had held for exactly 90 seconds, and a scope he had dialed with nothing but a cracked leather sling and the backs of his own eyes. No rangefinder, no ballistic app humming numbers into an earpiece, no wind meter clipped to a tripod, just an old man, a borrowed rifle, and a silence so complete that a hawk, crossing high over the ridge, would seem, for a moment, like the loudest thing in the county. Nobody in that crowd would be able to explain how. Colton Radcliffe, sponsored by an optics company whose name was stitched across his vest in silver thread, would stand with his stopwatch raised halfway to his mouth and simply stop moving, as if his own hand had been unplugged. If you've ever been counted out, before anyone bothered to ask what you'd already done, type "steady" in the comments. But that comes later. First, the morning, ordinary as a Tuesday, laid out the way mornings are laid out, before anyone knows they're about to become the day people talk about for years. It started the way it always started, with an ache in a man's shoulder that had nothing to do with what he'd come to do, and everything to do with 55 years of leaning into fence posts, calving heifers in the cold, and carrying feed sacks up a hill that got a little steeper every winter. Everett Pruett woke before the sun, the way he always had, made 1 cup of coffee in a percolator older than most of the trucks in the Millwood lot, and sat at his kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug until the tremor in his left hand settled enough to trust it. He did not know, that morning, that this particular Sunday would be different from the 1,400 and some Sundays before it. He only knew that the wind out of the northwest had a taste to it, faint and mineral, the taste it got before it swung around and started running downhill instead of up, and that somewhere in a duffel bag behind his truck seat, wrapped in a shop rag gone soft as felt, a sling with a brass keeper and a scratched serial number was waiting for him, the way it had waited for 60 years, patient as a held breath, patient as a debt nobody had thought to collect. He drank his coffee. He looked at a pair of reading glasses resting on the windowsill above the sink, untouched, exactly where they'd sat for 6 years. Then he got in his truck and drove the 40 minutes to Millwood, same as always, not knowing that today, for the first time, he would not stay in the parking lot. The gravel lot at Millwood sat below a ridge, the color of a sold penny, and Everett backed his truck into the same corner space he always took, nose out, the way a man parks who has spent a life expecting to need to leave in a hurry, for reasons that had nothing to do with precision shooting. He cut the engine and let the tick of cooling metal fill the cab for a moment before he moved. His barn coat had gone the color of dry wheat somewhere around its 10th winter, and had stayed that color through its 30th. It hung open over a flannel shirt worn thin and pale at the elbows, the plaid pattern faded to a rumor of itself, and above his collar sat a face weathered the way fence posts weather, silvered and split-grained and entirely unbothered by the process. His cap, a seed corn giveaway from a feed store that had closed before some of Millwood's paying customers were born, had been bleached by 3 decades of sun until its lettering was more suggestion than word. He did not get out right away. He sat with both hands on the wheel, and anyone watching closely, and nobody was watching at all, that was rather the point, would have noticed the left one trembling, a fine, persistent shiver, the kind that comes standard with age and does not care whose age it visits. It was not the tremor of fear. It was simply the tremor of a body that had spent itself generously for a long time and had begun, in its 80th year, to send the bill. On the dashboard, Tucked in the seam where the vinyl met the windshield sat a pair of woman's reading glasses, tortoiseshell frames gone slightly loose at one hinge. He had carried them in that truck for 6 years. He did not wear them. He did not clean them. He simply kept them where the morning light would find them first, before it found anything else in the cab, the way some men keep a photograph and some men keep a ring, and he kept a pair of glasses that had belonged to Doris Pruitt, who used to sit on the porch step and squint at her paperback over their rims and tell him, most Sundays of their life together, to go on and clean that rifle if it was going to make him feel useful. He reached behind the bench seat and drew out a canvas duffel gone soft as a hound's ear, and from inside it, wrapped in a rag stained dark with decades of oil, he lifted a leather sling. It had cracked along one fold the width of a knuckle, its stitching hand done in waxed thread that had yellowed unevenly, and it carried a worn spot the exact width of a thumb, pressed smooth by a grip that had closed around it thousands of times across thousands of hours in weather that did not care for men or their equipment. At its buckle end, a brass keeper held 2 faded letters and a string of numbers scratched into the metal by something sharper than a knife point and older than patience. He did not look at the range yet. He looked instead at the fence line that separated the parking lot from the firing berms, the same fence he had looked through every Sunday for 4 years, and something in his jaw tightened and released, the way a man's jaw does when he is deciding, again, not to do a thing he has decided against every week for 4 years. Today, for reasons the lot itself could not have explained, he did not sit. He hooked the sling over his shoulder, closed the truck door with the soft economy of a man who has closed 10,000 doors and sees no reason to close this one any harder, and walked toward the gate. The firing line at Millwood ran 200 yards of covered benches before it opened onto the long valley where the real distances lived, out past 600 meters, past 1,200, all the way to the ridge where a single steel plate stood at 2,400, gray against gray stone, untouched all season by paying customers who had spent, collectively, more money on optics than most ranches spent on equipment in a decade. Colton Radcliffe stood at the 400-meter bench with 6 students arranged around him in a loose crescent, the way disciples arrange themselves around a man who has decided he is worth arranging around. He wore a vest stitched with his sponsor's silver lettering, and every few seconds he tapped a stopwatch twice against his palm before he spoke, a habit that had become so automatic he likely could not have told you when it started. Winds shifting northwest to west, gusting maybe 8, he was saying, tapping the stopwatch, which means your hold needs to walk with it, friend, not sit still like you're hoping it'll be polite. That was when Everett came through the gate. He did not hurry. He never had. He crossed the gravel with the sling over one shoulder and the duffel left behind in the truck, and something about the unhurried economy of his walk drew eyes the way a held silence draws attention in a loud room. Tanner Quimby, the range's youngest safety officer, 8 months into the job and still new enough to notice things the others had trained themselves out of noticing, looked up first. He watched Everett's boots find the gravel, watched the barn coat move without catching on anything, and something in his chest did a small, unannounced thing he did not yet have words for. Colton noticed second, and noticed the way a performer notices an unplanned prop wander onto his stage. "Help you, sir?" he called, not unkindly, but with the particular brightness of a man performing hospitality for an audience. "Like to rent a lane," Everett said. 3 words. He had a voice like a gate hinge that had been oiled recently, but not often, low and unhurried. Colton's eyes went over him the way you'd glance over a used truck you had already decided not to buy, the faded coat, the bleached cap, the cracked sling with its brass keeper catching the morning light. A smile started at one corner of his mouth. "We rent lanes, sure," he said, "but I've got to ask, friend, you seeing all right today? Some of these targets are out past what a lot of younger eyes can manage." A ripple of laughter went through the crescent of students, quick and easy, the laughter of people who like their instructor and want him to know it. "I can see fine," Everett said. Colton held up the sling's strap between 2 fingers, careful, the way you'd hold something you suspected of being unsanitary. "This the rig you're running?" "I appreciate antiques. I do. My granddad had a rig like this," he said, letting it drop. "But out here, we're dialing turrets in tenths of a mil, running rangefinders good to a meter. This," and he gestured at the sling with the flat of his hand, "this is a nice piece of nostalgia, sir, but it's not going to hold a 2,000-yard zero. Might not even hold 100. More laughter, warmer now, encouraged by his tone. One of the sponsored students, a broad young man in a company cap that matched Colton's vest, said something Everett didn't catch, and the laugh that followed didn't need translating. "That old man can't even see the target," Colton said again, this time turned half toward his crescent, playing the line for the room the way he'd clearly played lines for rooms before, easy and practiced, and utterly without malice, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd meant it cruel. Everett said nothing. He looked past Colton's shoulder, out along the valley, to the ridge where a small gray rectangle sat 2,400 meters distant, and something crossed his face that was not hurt and was not anger. It was closer to recognition, the look of a man watching weather he has seen arrive before. "That's the plate nobody's touched all year," Colton went on, warming to it now, tapping his stopwatch twice. 31 students, 4 seasons, nobody's rung it. You want a lane, friend, I'll get you a lane. 400 meters, nice and gentle, will get you started slow. "I'd take the far one," Everett said. The crescent went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it thinks it has just heard something funny it hasn't fully processed yet. Then it broke into laughter again, louder this time, and Colton laughed loudest of all, shaking his head, tapping the stopwatch against his palm twice more, like a gavel closing the matter. "Sir," he said, "that plate has eaten better shooters than either of us. I'm not trying to be unkind. I just don't want you walking home disappointed." "I generally don't," Everett said, and that was all. The bet arrived the way these things always arrive, dressed up as a joke that everyone involved knows, somewhere under the laughing, is not entirely a joke. One of the sponsored students, the broad one in the matching cap, said it first. Said if the old man really thought he could ring the far steel, they ought to put something on it, and the crowd liked that idea considerably more than they'd liked the first joke, because now there was a shape to the afternoon, a story they could tell later. $100, the student said. "He rings it, I'll pay it myself." Colton spread his hands like a man being reasonable against his own better judgment. "Tell you what," he said, "let's not take a man's money over a joke gone too far. But if you want to try, sir, truly, I'm not going to stop you. I'll even lend you a rifle." He turned toward the rack behind the bench and pulled free a lightweight bolt gun, the kind sold to first-time hunters, and held it out with both hands like a man presenting a prize at a county fair. "This here's about as forgiving a rig as we've got. Nice and light. Won't kick your shoulder loose. Good starter rifle, if you want to give it a real go before you commit to 2,400 meters on your first day out." The laugh that followed was gentler this time, almost fond, the kind of laugh a crowd gives when it believes it is being kind. Everett took the rifle. He turned it over once in his hands, checked the bolt, checked the chamber was clear, all with the brisk, unbothered competence of a man checking a tool he has checked 10,000 times before, on 10,000 mornings that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. He did not ask for a rangefinder. He did not ask for a wind meter. He walked instead to the edge of the covered bench, stepped out from under its shade into open sun, and lifted his bare right hand, palm out, fingers slightly spread, and held it there at shoulder height for perhaps 4 full seconds. Tanner Quimby was the only one watching closely enough to see it. He had drifted a few steps nearer during the laughter, drawn the way he'd been drawn since Everett came through the gate, and from where he stood, he watched the old man's hand hang in the air, watched his eyes track something invisible moving through the heat above the valley floor, grass bending in a swale 400 meters out, a heat shimmer rippling off a rock face at 800, dust lifting faint and lazy from a dry wash further still, and watched him lower the hand, satisfied, the way a man closes a book he has already read. Nobody else saw it. Colton was busy narrating for the crowd, saying something about how the wind gauge on his tripod read 6 from the northwest, gusting to 9, and how any real shooter would want that number confirmed before dialing. Everett said nothing to correct him. He simply lifted the borrowed rifle to his shoulder, drew the cracked sling taut around his left forearm the way another man might draw on a pair of old work gloves, and settled into the stance the way water settles into a low place, without effort, without decision, as if his body had simply been waiting for permission to remember something it had never actually forgotten. Tanner felt something tighten in his chest that he could not yet name, and did not try to. He only knew, with the sudden clean certainty young men sometimes get about old men and rarely trust, that he was about to watch something the range had not seen before and would not see again for a long while. The sling drew tight around Everett's forearm with a sound like old rope settling, and his left hand, which had trembled faintly all morning over coffee and steering wheel alike, went still the instant it closed around the worn thumb spot in the leather. Whatever the tremor was, it did not survive contact with that strap. It simply stopped, the way a clock stops when you finally still the pendulum with your palm. He did not ask Colton for the come-ups. He did not ask for a wind call. He turned the borrowed rifle's turret by feel, counting clicks under his thumb with his eyes half closed, dialing not from a chart, but from a number that lived somewhere behind his sternum, a number he had carried since he was 24 years old and had never once needed to write down: 2,400 meters. He knew that distance, the way another man knows the number of steps between his porch and his mailbox. He settled his cheek against the stock. He breathed in, let half of it back out, and held the rest, the way a man holds his breath underwater, patient, unhurried, entirely unbothered by an audience that had gone, in the last 10 seconds, from laughing to watching to something quieter than either. The crack of the shot rolled out across the valley and came back off the ridge a full 2.5 seconds later as a second, smaller sound, and between those two sounds, nobody at Millwood Long Range Facility breathed. Then the steel rang. It rang the way a struck bell rings, a bright metallic peal rolling back down the valley toward the firing line, and for one full second, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Nobody quite believed the sound they had heard had come from where they knew it had come from. Then the spotting scope operator, a sponsored student named Reed, who had spent 4 seasons confirming misses on that exact plate, said, in a voice gone thin with disbelief, "Hit, center mass. That's a hit," as though saying it twice might make it true a second time, in case the first time had been a mistake of the ear. Colton Radcliffe stood with his stopwatch half raised to his mouth, 2 fingers still poised to tap it against his palm a third time, and the gesture simply stopped there, unfinished, his hand hanging in the air the way a held breath hangs in cold weather. His mouth was open around the beginning of a word he did not finish. The silver lettering across his vest suddenly looked less like sponsorship and more like a costume. The crowd that had been laughing 90 seconds earlier had gone entirely, uncannily still, the particular stillness that comes over people who have just watched their own certainty walk out of the room without asking permission. One of the students took an unconscious step backward from the bench, as if putting distance between himself and something he did not yet understand. Reed lowered the spotting scope from his eye slowly, blinking, looking not at the ridge anymore, but at Everett, the way you'd look at a locked door that had just opened on its own. Everett lowered the rifle from his shoulder, worked the bolt once out of habit, and set it down across the bench with the same unbothered economy he'd picked it up with. He loosened the sling from his forearm, and the moment the leather released, the faint tremor crept back into his left hand, small and persistent, as if it had only been waiting politely outside the door for its turn again. Wind was 11, not 6, he said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. Running downhill by the time it reaches that ridge, your gauge reads what's happening down here at the bench, doesn't read what's happening up there. He nodded toward the plate, small and gray and rung. You dial for down here, you'll always miss up there. Nobody laughed at that. Nobody had laughter left in them. Colton finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than the one he'd used all morning, stripped of its performance, stripped even of the word he liked to lean on. "That's," he started and stopped, and tried again. "How did you do that without even a rangefinder, a wind meter?" You didn't check anything. I checked it a long time ago, Everett said. It was not an answer that satisfied anyone, and he did not offer another. He simply stood at the bench with his hands loose at his sides, the sling coiled once around his fist, looking out at the ridge, the way a man looks at a grave he has visited before and will visit again, and the silence that followed him was not empty. It was full of a question nobody in that crowd yet had the right words to ask. Tanner Quimby broke first, not with a question to Everett, but by turning and walking briskly toward the range office, already pulling his phone from his jacket pocket, because some instinct in him, some quiet certainty that had been building since the moment he watched a bare hand rise into the wind, told him this was no longer a story that belonged only to Millwood's Sunday crowd. It was a story that belonged to somebody older than the range itself, and he thought he knew, or half knew, who that somebody might be. Tanner's call did not take long to place, though it took him 3 tries to steady his voice enough to explain what he was asking for. He reached Brock Sinclair, retired Command Sergeant Major and volunteer historian at the County Veterans Hall, on the second ring, and said only that there was a man out at Millwood he thought Brock ought to come see, an old farmer who'd rung the far steel with a borrowed rifle and a cracked sling, and that something about the way the man had said, "I checked it a long time ago," had put a chill straight through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. Brock Sinclair did not ask many questions. He said he'd be there within the hour, and something in the speed of that answer told Tanner he had guessed correctly about more than he understood yet. While they waited, the crowd at the bench did not disperse so much as reconfigure itself, clustering in 2s and 3s, murmuring, glancing back toward Everett, who had drifted a short distance off, and stood now near the fence line with his sling coiled loosely in one hand, looking out at the ridge the way he'd looked at it every Sunday for 4 years, except that today he stood on the inside of the fence instead of the outside of it. Colton Radcliffe, meanwhile, retreated to the range office on the pretense of paperwork, though what he actually wanted was 5 minutes alone with the filing cabinet, because a question had lodged itself under his ribs the moment the steel rang and would not shake loose. Who built this range, and why did none of it, none of the pamphlets, none of the plaques, none of the glossy rebrand materials his sponsor had sent over for next month's ceremony, ever actually say? He found the answer, or the shape of an answer, in a file folder gone soft at the corners, tucked behind newer paperwork in a cabinet that hadn't been opened, judging by the dust, in longer than his 4 years at Millwood. The founding document was a single typed page, yellowed, the ink gone the color of weak tea, stating that Millwood Long Range Facility had been established 58 years earlier on land donated by, and here the page grew frustratingly plain, Sergeant R. Sinclair et al., in trust for training purposes. No unit named, no first name given for the sergeant, no mention of what et al. Might have once stood for, what names, what faces, what mountainside they had walked before anyone thought to call it a range. He carried the page out to the porch of the office, frowning at it, and it was there that Marisol Carrington found him, having driven up from the regional office an hour early for a ribbon cutting, still 6 days off, dressed sharper than the gravel lot deserved, her smile arriving a half-second before her handshake did. "You've had quite a morning," she said, and something in the careful brightness of it told Colton she already knew more than he did. "There's an old man out there," Colton said, "who just rang the 2400 plate with a borrowed rifle. And there's a founding record in that cabinet that doesn't name a single soul who actually built this place. I don't understand how both of those things are true on the same day." Marisol's smile did not move, though something behind her eyes did, briefly, like a shadow crossing water. "Old paperwork," she said. "Half these county ranges have gaps like that. It's why we're rebranding, Colton. Clean slate, clear story, easier for people to invest in something they understand." She glanced toward the porch rail, toward the crowd still gathered near the 400-meter bench, toward the ridge beyond it. Friday's ceremony removes all that ambiguity. New plaque, new name, a story people can actually hold on to. "The old plaque's still up," Colton said slowly. "I always figured somebody'd get around to explaining it eventually." "They won't need to," Marisol said, "after Friday. And something about the ease of that sentence, the practiced ease of a woman closing a door she had been leaning against for months, sat wrong in Colton's chest, in a way he did not yet have the vocabulary to challenge. Out by the fence, Everett Pruitt stood with his sling coiled in one hand, watching a gray truck he did not recognize come up the gravel road, faster than county custom generally allowed, and something in his shoulders, tired as they were, straightened by half an inch, the way a man's shoulders straighten when a debt he has carried alone for 6 decades is finally about to be shared. The gray truck rolled to a stop hard enough to kick up a small curtain of dust, and Brock Sinclair was out of it before the engine had fully settled, moving with the particular brisk economy of a man who had spent 30 years crossing rooms at other people's urgent request. He was 68, broad through the shoulders still, silver-headed, and he crossed the gravel lot with his eyes already fixed past Colton, past Tanner, past the whole gathered crowd, straight to the old man standing near the fence, with a cracked sling coiled in one hand. He stopped 3 feet short of Everett and came to a posture the whole yard recognized, even if none of them could have named it, spine set, chin level, the stillness of a man reporting rather than merely standing. "Whiskey 6, Brock said, and his voice, steady through the first syllable, cracked clean down the middle of the second word, the way old wood cracks along a grain nobody knew was there until the weight finally found it. "It's an honor, sir." The crowd did not laugh now. The crowd did not make any sound at all. Colton Radcliffe, who had crossed the yard behind Brock without quite meaning to, stopped mid-stride, one hand half lifted toward a gesture he never completed, his mouth open around a question that had lost its footing before it found words. "Whiskey 6, he repeated, faintly, as though testing whether the syllables might mean something less than they clearly meant. That's a real call sign. That's somebody real. Long-range reconnaissance, 1965 to 70, Brock said, not looking away from Everett. Observer, then spotter, for the finest instructor I ever served under. I was 11 years old the first time I heard that call sign, sir, from my own father, who served 2 ranks under yours." He drew a slow breath. "This range sits on land your commanding officer donated in your unit's name. I've been trying to prove that for 11 years, with half a record and no photograph, and here you've been sitting in the parking lot the whole time. Didn't see the use in coming in," Everett said, "till today." Brock's eyes went to the sling still coiled in Everett's hand, to the brass keeper with its scratched letters and numbers, and something in his face opened the way a door opens onto a room a man has heard described his whole life, but never entered. "May I?" he asked, and Everett passed it over without a word. Brock turned the keeper to the light, ran his thumb across the scratched serial number, and looked up with an expression that had gone somewhere past astonishment into something quieter. "This matches the founding rifle," he said, "the one listed in the county archive as lost." "It's not lost. It's been in your duffel bag the whole time." He looked to Colton. "This man paced this mountainside by hand 6 decades ago at his commander's request, in the final week his unit served together, before they scattered to 6 different corners of this country and never all stood in one place again. The founding record in your office doesn't name him because whoever filed it 58 years ago didn't think a spotter's name mattered next to a sergeant's." Marisol Carrington had come up onto the porch steps in time to hear the last of it, and her smile, which had held all morning with the patience of a woman used to controlling rooms, finally slipped, just slightly, at one corner. "That record isn't vague by accident," Colton said slowly, turning to look at her, the pieces arranging themselves behind his eyes in real time. "You knew. You've known this whole time." "I didn't dispute anything," Marisol said, careful now, choosing each word the way a woman chooses footing on ice. "I simply recommended the board treat the older archival material as clutter ahead of the rebrand. It's standard practice." "There's a photograph," Brock said quietly. "The founding unit, all 14 of them, standing at what's now the 400-meter bench. I've spent 11 years hunting for it. It surfaced 8 months ago according to the acquisitions log I keep with the Historical Society. And then it disappeared again, the same week your sponsorship contract was signed. Marisol did not answer that directly. She did not need to. The silence she left in its place, and the way her eyes moved briefly toward the optics logo stitched into Colton's vest, said enough. A rival company's name was embossed in the corner of that old photograph, faint but legible, and no amount of rebrand polish could make a press photographer's lens unsee it once printed. Burying a war record had never been the goal. Protecting a logo from an old rival had been the whole of it, and 14 names had simply been collateral to a marketing decision nobody upstairs had thought twice about. Colton Radcliffe stood very still in the gravel, his stopwatch forgotten in his pocket, looking at Everett Pruitt, the way a man looks at a debt he did not know he owed until the collector arrived at his own front gate. The offer came from Reed first, the broad-shouldered student who had proposed the $100 wager not 2 hours earlier, now approaching with the bill actually folded in his hand, sheepish, holding it out like a boy, returning something borrowed without asking. Everett looked at the money, the way a man looks at a fair offer for the wrong thing. "Keep it," Everett said. "Buy your own students a round of coffee after lessons. That's a better use for it than my pocket." Brock Sinclair, still holding the cracked sling with something close to reverence, asked the question everyone standing in that gravel lot had been circling without saying aloud. "The board's prepared to restore the founding record properly, sir. Your name on the new plaque, alongside the rebrand, however you'd like it worded. You've more than earned first billing." "Don't want first billing," Everett said. He reached into the duffel bag Tanner had carried over from the truck without being asked, and drew out a small ledger, its cover cracked and soft, its pages gone the brown of strong tea, and opened it to a page marked with a strip of leather, worn as smooth as the sling itself. 14 names were written there in a young man's careful hand, names that had not been spoken aloud together in 60 years. These 14 cleared that mountainside with me. Some didn't make it home from what came after. Some did, and are gone now anyway, same as most everybody gets gone eventually. I've kept this book so long I don't rightly remember not keeping it. Put all 14 names on that plaque, in whatever order you like, and I don't care one bit where mine falls in the list." Brock took the ledger with both hands, the way a man takes something a great deal heavier than its weight. Tanner Quimby, standing a little apart from the others, found himself the one Everett drifted toward once the gravel lot's business had settled into quiet arrangements between Brock and the board. The young officer had a dozen questions crowding his mouth, and managed only the smallest of them. "Every Sunday," Tanner said. 4 years. Why'd you never come in before today?" Everett was quiet a moment, looking out past the fence toward the ridge, toward the small gray plate that had rung once and gone still again. "My wife used to sit on the porch step back home," he said, "shelling peas most Sundays, humming some hymn she never did finish all the verses to, and she'd watch me clean my rifle on the step beside her, not saying much, just watching. 6 years since she's been gone. I got in the habit of driving out here Sunday mornings because it was the one place left that felt like she might still be watching. Didn't need to come inside the fence for that. Fence never stopped her from watching anything." He looked at Tanner, and something in his weathered face softened by a fraction nobody but Tanner was close enough to see. "I didn't come back for the range, son. I came back because she used to sit right here and watch me clean it." Tanner did not know what to say to that, and did not try to fill the silence with anything. Colton Radcliffe approached last, hands empty, stopwatch left in his pocket where it had stayed since the shot rang. He stood a moment before he found the words, and when he did, they came out smaller and plainer than anything he'd said all morning. "I owe you an apology," he said. "More than one, probably. I made a show out of you in front of my own students, and I did it because I trusted a gauge on a tripod over a man who'd clearly already read that whole valley before I was born." He paused. "I'd take it as a kindness, sir, if you'd teach me to read wind the way you do, by feel, not by app." Everett looked at him a long moment, the way a man looks at ground before deciding whether it's worth planting. "Give me your hand," he said, and lifted his own bare palm into the light morning air, and Colton, a young man who had spent 4 years believing his instruments could read anything worth reading, raised his hand alongside the old farmer's, and for the first time since he'd arrived at Millwood, said nothing at all, only watched and waited and tried to feel what the old man had been feeling in that air since before Colton had learned to walk. 6 days later, the gravel lot at Millwood filled before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, trucks and cars parked in rows that stretched clear to the county road, and Everett Pruitt backed his own truck into the same corner space he'd always taken, nose out, though today he did not sit inside it and watch through the fence. He walked through the gate for the second time in his life, the cracked sling left at home on its peg, because some things, once carried long enough, are allowed finally to rest. The old plaque had not been torn down after all. It stood freshly cleaned beside a new one, brass and unweathered, the optics company's name reduced to a modest line in the corner where Marisol Carrington, quietly reassigned within the week to a division that did not require her judgment on matters of history, no longer had any say in its placement. Brock Sinclair stood at a small podium set up before the 400-meter bench, the recovered photograph enlarged and mounted beside him. 14 young faces squinting into a sun 60 years gone, and one by one he read the names from Everett's ledger aloud into a still morning. No editorializing, no speeches, just names, each one landing into the quiet like a stone dropped into a deep well. Everett did not stand at the podium. He sat in his truck at the edge of the lot, engine off, window down, listening to each name carried across the gravel on air that still, even now, tasted faintly mineral before it turned. On the dashboard, Doris's reading glasses caught the early light and threw a small bright shape across the seat beside him, and when the 14th name was read, he did not